Corporate needs you to find a difference between this camera and this camera.
They're the same camera.
They were not the same camera.
So, we have these two different cameras. The Red Weapon Helium and the Blackmagic Design Ursa Mini Pro G2. They're alike in many ways and also different in many ways. How, you might ask? Well, first of all, resolution, both super 35mm. However, the Red sporting an 8K sensor versus 4.6K on the Ursa G2 means that the pixels on the Ursa G2 are going to be way bigger. That could have consequences on noise, MTF, any sort of spatial reproduction aspects. That's something worth looking into, I think. It's not just about spatial aspects. There's other elements that make a cinema camera worthwhile. You're probably wondering how are we going to assess all of these things? We've constructed and devised a series of tests in multiple categories, from dynamic range to color reproduction. We're just gonna slap these two cameras side by side and just start rolling, see what happens. Grab the footage, take a closer look at it. So without further ado, let's get right into the first scene. The OETF chart. So what is an OETF chart? An optoelectronic transfer function chart. It's really just a representation of how the camera converts scene luminance, the light in the scene, to pixel values. There's 36 patches of increasing luminance from black to white, and you can use that to assess the overall dynamic range that the camera is capable of. Now, Red has some very hefty claims. Very, very hefty claims. 16.5 stops of dynamic range. I'll believe it when I see it. Blackmagic Design, on the other hand, a little less ambitious. They only claim 15 stops of dynamic range. But we take a look at the charts, pull the charts up, we're only getting about 15 stops for the Red and 14 for the Ursa. And that's still not bad. So that's cool and all. Charts are really cool, right? They provide us with a lot of information and numbers, but they're kind of boring, really. You don't feel much when you look at a chart. So to gauge the performance of these cameras, we set up a high dynamic range scene with actors and sets. How did that go?
A shot with a dynamic range totaling around 15 stops was set up so we could try to test the limits that each camera claims to have in an actual scene to see how well they could retain the details at their farthest underexposures and their farthest overexposures. In the overexposures and highlights, each camera clipped and didn't preserve much detail in the lace curtains. In the underexposed shadows of each scene, it actually is clear that the Ursa lacks much more definition and detail than the helium does. The helium captures the detail and definition of the character in the window much better at that underexposure than the Ursa. The Ursa also has worse color definition in the underexposures, meaning that the shirt of the person in the window becomes much more brown and muddy rather than black. Overall, it seems that the helium can make a much better image than the Ursa. However, it takes a lot more time and skill in post-production and color correction than the Ursa does to make that image the best that it can be. With more time and more experience in Resolve, the red footage can definitely be brought to its highest potential, which lines up with its target audience of higher-end cinema, unlike the Ursa, whose target audience is more lower-budget, smaller crews. We used a Kodak 18% gray reflectance card to assess the noise of each camera at a 2-stop overexposure, 2-stop underexposure, and at a normal exposure using their native ISOs of 800. By calculating the standard deviation of the noise in each image at each exposure, the noise for each camera can be assessed. When the noise of each camera is compared, the just noticeable difference is found. The just noticeable difference is when the noise difference is just barely visible about 50% of the time. When the JND is positive, the noise is more perceptible, while when it is negative, it is not perceptible at all. When the red is compared to the Ursa, it has almost entirely positive JNDs, meaning that the red has more clearly visible noise at each exposure than the Ursa. On the opposite hand, when the Ursa is compared to the red, all of those JNDs are flipped and they become negative, meaning that the noise difference from the Ursa to the red is far less noticeable. Ultimately, this means that the Ursa has less noisy images compared to the red helium, which was predicted earlier when talking about the size of the pixels on the Ursa sensor compared to the helium sensor. It really does mean that the image will be less noisy. The noise in each camera will also be assessed further when looking at the color checker.
And we had these at normal exposure, 2 stops under, and 2 stops over. So for the normal exposure, we can see if we compare the two color checker charts that the colors in the red helium seem to be more saturated overall than in the Ursa. The greens are actually less red than the Ursa, creating a more vibrant hue that we see in the color reproduction in the red helium. Then we have the blue. So in terms of the blue, we can also see that in the red helium, it seems to be darker and just more blue, as you might put it. So overall, in the normal exposure, we can say that the red, magenta, and blue hues with the red helium camera, have more red tones in them, so it makes them appear brighter. In order to get this very vibrant image from the red helium, I had to do an extensive amount of color correction because the log footage, right straight from the camera without anything done to it, looks disgustingly green. Moving on to the underexposure, the results look pretty similar to the normal exposure in terms of the color reproduction in both of the cameras, except the colors are obviously darker because they were underexposed. However, if we turn to the overexposure, there is something interesting that happens here. We can see that the actually previously muted or less saturated colors in the normal image for their Blackmagic Ursa camera actually look a little bit more saturated than the overexposed red helium footage, especially if you look at the yellow, magenta, and cyan hues. The Ursa only has an ISO range of 200 to 3200 ISO, while the red helium has a range of 250 to 6400. So first we tested them at the lowest possible ISO. So in the 200 ISO, the Ursa actually looks more vibrant than its normal exposure if you look at the yellow hues especially. So when we look at the two color checkers at 3200 ISO, they are obviously more noisier than the normal exposures. However, we can see that the red helium color checker is actually a little bit more noisier at the 3200 ISO. As we mentioned before, charts are cool, but like, how do they play in an actual scene? So to test this, we had a lot of like memory colors, which are essentially just some cup noodles, some pasta, some chips, you know. An important consideration to keep in mind when we made these comparisons is that the log footage of the helium before color grading had a green tint. So for every shot, a gray card was used as a reference to the colorist to match between the two cameras. The main difference you can see right away with these colors is that the green Lay's bag is way more saturated in the red helium footage than the Ursa. In the Ursa footage, it kind of looks a little bit more like a mint color, while in the red helium, it is very green and vibrant. As you can see, the blue, red, and pink plates on the wall are also much more vibrant on the red helium footage, and this was to be expected as before the results in the color checker showed that the red helium would be more vibrant in its normal exposure.
Alright, but enough talk about how well these cameras can encode the color of plastic and paper plates. What really matters is the human skin. That's what we all care about anyway, in the end, really, is ourselves. So, how do you measure how well human skin is encoded in a camera? You just record a whole bunch of faces at different exposure levels on both cameras. And we have several different faces of varying skin tones, which we decided to over and underexpose by 2 stops at a constant ISO of 800. The Ursa clipped a little more than the red helium did at the overexposure at plus 2 stops on the lightest skin tone model of ours, while both of them clipped as one would expect at 2 stops overexposure. Just the Ursa did a little more and was a little more ugly than the helium, and that's kind of the overall theme when it comes to skin tone, is that the Ursa did not look as good as the helium. That's the real question is, does the helium actually look more like human skin tone, what we see in our eyes when we look at other humans, or does it just look more like the expectation for skin tone that has already been set by cameras of the past and of the present that are used in Hollywood, like the Arri Alexa? All I know is when I look at the helium footage, it makes me feel a lot better than when I look at the Ursa footage. And I guess that's all that really matters in the end. A commonly mentioned metric used to compare spatial resolving performance is MTF, or the modulation transfer function. We measured this on both cameras at a native ISO of 800 and a normal exposure using a special chart, the ISO 12233 chart, which you're looking at right now. We made sure to shoot with as little compression applied as possible and at full sensor utilization. Pardon the graphs, but these just show how well the image is reproduced at increasingly finer levels of detail. The further right on the graph, the higher the measured frequency. You want there to be more area under the curve, as this corresponds with higher resolving power. As we would expect, with the overall 3-fold increase in pixels on the helium sensor, its MTF performance is better for both horizontal and vertical cases. The blue channel exhibits some odd behavior in the horizontal case, which could perhaps be attributed to sharpening. The Ursa holds its own to a surprising degree. Another good way to test resolving power is on fine edges during the compositing process, otherwise known as green screening.
What the hell, Filmco? We're not making a calendar here. Let's get back to work. What are we doing here?
Working?
Oh my god.
Sorry, boss.
Both cameras were then tested against a green screen to see how well they would define the fine edges of moving hair when composited. We figured this would be best tested by using hair, which can be fairly fine, with a fan blowing on it, so it would be moving fine details. For the compositing process, the helium took a much longer time to get to where it was. The Ursa seemed to result in the best composite of the two cameras. Not only was it quick to put together, but it also had far less green leakage, nicer edges, and resulted in a cleaner image and end result. The helium, on the other hand, took much longer to composite and did not result in as good of an image. There's still green light and leakage on the top of the head on the blonde area of the bangs. Overall, in our results, the Ursa comes out as a better composite compared to the helium. However, similar to the HDR scene, a more experienced VFX compositor could likely get rid of the green leakage and rough edges that we experienced during post-production.
So overall, we at Filmco have determined that yes, there is a difference between these two cameras. The helium and the Ursa occupy completely different parts of the market and are at different price points. Overall, the helium is better than the Ursa, but that's not the point. The Ursa is cheaper than the helium. You use the Ursa because you can afford to use the Ursa, and you use the helium because you can afford to use the helium. They both perform very well for their price points. It all comes down to what you're willing to spend and what you're willing to put up with in post, because the helium is a real beast to wrangle. But good cameras. Like them both. Thank you.